So tomorrow night is the 15th day of the month of Av. So I wanted to do something, to talk about the background of what that day is and the connection to the Torah, of the Torah portion that we're going to read this coming week. So as you know that this past Shabbat was the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, which was observed on Sunday. Saturday and Sunday is because it was Shabbat. The commemoration and observance of it is postponed for after Shabbat because we did not mourn publicly on Shabbat. But just 5 days afterwards, we have the 15th, what's known as Tu B'Av. And what I want to do is I'm going to read a section from the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then we're going to go back to our Torah to understand in a sense, almost the paradox of going from a very, very low point to a very, very high point. And the nature of the interplay of how we deal with this emotion. The Tu B'Av in the Talmud, in the tractate of Tainit, so I'm going to read from here. The Talmud here explains, when after he talks about all the fast days, the word Tanit means fast. And so there's an entire tractate of the Talmud that discusses the fast days of the Jewish calendar and why we would fast on what basis. Today, for all intents and purposes, there are 6 fast days. There are 6 what we call public fast days. It's called Tanit Sibor. Literally means, in Hebrew, a public fast. Public fast means something that's incumbent upon all of the Jewish population. 6 fast days a year. 2 of them are 24-hour fasts, Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. The other 4 are sunrise, sunset fasts, day of. The only biblical fast that we have is Yom Kippur. It's the only biblically mandated fast. All the other ones, the other 5 are all rabbinic, and they all are based upon historic events that have happened, which created the terms and the background for this fast. Actually, the majority of the Talmud does not deal specifically with those fasts, ironically. It deals with fasts that historically communities would impose upon themselves for reasons that had a lot to do with the geography of the land of Israel. The land of Israel is very, very dependent upon rainfall for its survival. And it's interesting that the Torah in Deuteronomy, as the Jews are coming into Israel, Moses tells them, we'll do this inside, because we're going to read that soon. Moses is telling them the good news that the land that you are about to go into is not like the land that you've come from, which is the land they were coming from, Egypt. Right? He says the land that you came from, the land was fertile because it was dependent upon the Nile. So even till today, we know Egypt, the fertility of Egypt. That's why they used to worship the Nile, because the Nile was the god of the Egyptians. All their sustenance, their survival, came from the Nile River. And so the Nile floods the plains, the delta, and look on page 995.
What is the delta?
The Nile Delta is the plains all around the Nile, all the farming land. So when the Nile would overflow, they created canals irrigating from the Nile. So the Nile is the whole the breadbasket of Egypt. So Moses, who's never seen the land of Israel in that sense, he's never been there. He's explaining to the Jews, the topography and why they're so fortunate to be going to the land of Israel. And this is what he explains to them. He says, look in verse number 10. For the land to which you come to possess it is not like the land of Egypt that you left. Right? Are we all on the same page?
Mm-hmm.
Literally.
Where you would plant your seed and water on it on foot like a vegetable garden. But the land to which you cross over to possess it is a land of hills and valleys. From the rain of heaven will it drink water. It's a land that Hashem your God seeks out. The eyes of Hashem your God are always upon it, from the beginning of the year to year's end. This is a classic, one of the classic lines of the Torah. It's that Moshe tells the Jewish people. The eyes of God are on the land from the beginning of the year until the end of the year, constantly. Now, isn't God paying attention to the world all the time? Isn't the entire world God's world? What does it mean that the land of Israel has extra special attention, that God's eyes are on it? And what does it mean that the land that you're going to, the land of hills and valleys, is sustained by the rains of the heaven, where the land where they came from, Egypt, is sustained like a vegetable garden where you dig a canal and you let water seep into it. So Mike, I'm going to read note number 10 on the bottom of page 994. Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, okay. Eretz Israel is superior even to Goshen.
Goshen was the place where the Jews settled when they came to Egypt.
The choicest part of Egypt. For agriculture in Egypt was dependent entirely on the overflow of the Nile, but the river irrigated only the low-lying areas. To the rest of the farmland, especially the vegetable gardens that need more water than other crops, people had to bring water on foot.
Right, so you schlep water or dig canals, right?
From the Nile.
From the Nile. Judy, read the next note.
Eretz Israel does not need a Nile or serfs carrying water on their shoulders to water its fields. God himself provides water for the crops by showering the mountains and valleys with rain while you sleep in your beds. But there is another element here as well. The water supply comes not from the natural overflow of a huge river, but from rains that are very clearly under God's control. To have them, the Jew must be worthy. For if he neglects the commandments, it is inevitable that God will not provide rain. Although God can bring droughts on Egypt, too, Eretz Israel is more directly dependent on his mercy, and it will suffer drought for lesser sins than other countries. It is like a sick person who needs greater merit to be healed than a well person needs merely to remain healthy. This is an inspiring challenge, for the Jew in Eretz Israel is always conscious of God's closeness. He knows his conduct and his prayers matter because there is an intimate connection between his actions and his prosperity.
Now, by the way, this is from the Torah portion that we're going to be reading next week. Okay, yeah.
Is drought considered normally considered a punishment? It's not a natural cycle, but it's visited upon people who sin or people who do wrong?
It's a good question. So we believe that there's a providence, that everything is providential, and there are no boom and bust cycles that happen randomly because. We believe that everything is visited upon nature because of a reason. And if you look throughout the story, the entire book of Genesis, throughout the story, every period there was a famine and a drought where? In Israel. Abraham and Sarah have to go to Egypt because there's a famine in Israel. Isaac needs to go, famine in Israel. Jacob, and why did the tribes end up in Egypt? There's a hunger. You know, the dream, right? There's going to be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of hunger. There was this constant migration from Israel down to Egypt throughout the book of Genesis because time and time again, Israel is suffering from a drought and a famine. The question is why? Right? Why are the people in Egypt such big tzaddikim? Are they so righteous? Only in Israel they were suffering. So to answer your point, one of the things that points they make is that everything is determined by God. So it's not a natural thing. However, certain places are treated. Not all places are treated the same. And since the land of Israel is God's land, it's more sensitive. It's highly sensitive to the things that happened there, which was why Moses warns them that God will not tolerate behavior that would be tolerable in other places, and Israel is just not tolerated. And that's why in the Shema, we make mention in the second paragraph of the Shema. Keep reading on page 995. it leads right into the second portion of the Shema called V'haya im Shemoa Tishmo. Right? If you right, the Shema has three sections. There's the Shema and the V'ahavta, right? Then there's this middle section V'haya im Shemoa until Kimei Hashemayim ala Aretz, and the third section is the portion of the tzitzit about putting tzitzit until Adonai Elohechem Emet. That's the entirety of the Shema. It's composed of three sections. Two are in Deuteronomy, one's in Numbers. It's not in the Shema the way we say it. It's not written. It's not in chronological order, and I'll explain why. But this section deals with, if you will listen to my commandments I command you today, right? But look in verse 14. Then I shall provide rain for your land in its proper time, right? And it goes on to talk about the reward. But on page 997,
If you disobey,
if you don't,
then
in verse 17, he will restrain the heaven, there will be no rain, and the ground will not produce its yield. So what's happening here is that the Shema, which we say, is it's a testament to the fact that our actions in the land of Israel have a direct result on rainflow, right? And on that cycle. The note that the commentaries, that the Ramban and the other commentaries point out is that on the one hand, it's a privilege. On the other hand, it comes with a great responsibility, and to our chagrin, it can actually work against us. That we have great control about what's going to happen in the land of Israel, where other countries might be subject to other things, or they are not as dependent upon rainfall as the land of Israel is.
So
Even today, Israel, in that entire region, is much more sensitive to rain than all the other countries around it. And when it doesn't rain, it's also in a lot of trouble. All of the prayers that we do in the diaspora, praying for rain, are all concentrated on Israel. When we pray for rain, in our prayers, in the Shemon Esrei, on Shmini Atzeret, when we start praying for rain, on Passover, when we start praying, it's all based upon the cycle of the time in Israel. Nothing to do with anywhere else, because we're very focused on the rain season of Israel and how it's dependent upon the Jews' prayer and the Jews' action. The Rambam makes the point, we're asking why is that fair, and why would we want that relationship, is because it tells us that we have such an intimate connection with God that our actions matter. If we didn't have that connection, right? So someone who you don't have that kind of relationship with, when they do something that irks you, it doesn't bother you because you don't have a relationship. You know who bothers you the most? Your spouse, your children, your friends, your close friends. Those relationships, those people who are closest to you, have the ability to inflict great pain. They can inflict great joy. But those two go hand in hand. Because they can bring you great joy, right? That space that you have allows them also to bring on a lot of sorrow.
So this could be a foretelling, I think, of mankind's actions causing climate change, correct? So the drought, the Dead Sea's drying up because of what they're doing.
So land of Israel is Exhibit A in terms of what climate change means. When they say that climate change is man-made, in that sense, in the land of Israel, absolutely, right? Man-made means that our actions, because we're saying it in the Shema, that if we do this, this will happen. It's cause and effect. If we don't, it will not. It won't happen. The reverse will happen.
I mean, before the words climate change even existed, this was.
And the irony is, I was saying,
years.
there's an entire tractate of Talmud, of Mishnah called Tanit, in ancient times, so vulnerable were the Jews to rain, that if it didn't rain by a certain time, they would proclaim a public fast on all of Israel until it would start raining. So, right? So, do you know that the most famous prayer, one of the most famous prayers we have on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is Avinu Malkeinu. We open the ark. Avinu Malkeinu. Do you know where that prayer comes from? It's a prayer for rain. It was composed by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, it wasn't raining in the land of Israel. Rabbi Akiva started the prayer Avinu Malkeinu. Many of our prayers that we don't even know the origins are all based upon these stories. There's a famous story about Choni HaMa'agel. There were Jews who who were not going to come to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival because there was of shortages of water. And the Talmud tells stories about individuals and rabbis who came to the temple to cry out to God that your children are not going to come to Jerusalem to make the trek because of the drought situation. So most of the discussion in the Talmud, when it talks about fasting, is not about Tisha B'Av, it's not about Yom Kippur, it's about no rain, and the result of the Talmud discusses by which date certain people have to fast. If it doesn't rain by this point, they would do prayers in the synagogues, and by this point they would have a second fast day and a third fast day and a fourth fast day, and this is, we lived by a certain rhythm historically that we knew that it was real, and that our actions had a direct result. There's a famous rabbi. Have you heard of Choni Hama'agel? People who grew up in Israel maybe have heard. Choni was a rabbi. They called him Choni Hama'agel. Hama'agel in the Hebrew means the circle, from the word igul, because it wasn't raining and Jews weren't coming. They came to him and they said, if you don't do something. So Choni came and he stood in the temple courtyard and he made a circle. And he stepped in the circle. He told God, I'm not leaving the circle until it starts to rain. And he tells God, it's not for me and my honor and my father's honor. I'm doing it so your children should come. The Talmud, how a miracle happened, it started to rain. He got the nickname. He became known forever as Choni Hama'agel, Choni, the man of the circle man, right? The Talmud tells the story about an individual who went and had to procure water from a non-Jewish nobleman for the Jews to come, in order to secure that Jews should come to Jerusalem. And they made a deal that he thought for sure it's going to rain by that time, and he'll pay him back the water. But they made a deal, if it doesn't rain by this and this time, he owes him this and much gold for the water. And the story is, of course, not a cloud. The Jews came, they had the water, but then the day comes and the guy tells him, time's up, you have to pay me, right? And so the Talmud says he went to the Temple Mount and he started, and he started to cry. He said, I didn't make this deal for myself to show that I can do something. I did it so Jews should come to Jerusalem. Clouds come and it started to drip. And he says, God, for this is not the miracle I'm talking about, dripping. Right? We need a lot more water. And it started to thunder and lightning, and people were drenched. Thomas says that people had to run. It was flood. The guy's cisterns and things all overflowed, more than he had before. And he comes running to the guy and he says, I paid you back. I got your water. The guy goes, we had an agreement by sundown. It's dark outside. You owe me all. I don't care about now. We had a deal. You owe me all that money anyway. He runs back to the Temple Mount and he says, God, after all that, really? So the rain stopped, the clouds disperse, and God brings the sun back out. It was already nighttime. God made a miracle and he brought the sun back. The day wasn't over yet. I mean, you talk about the day-to-day life that the Jews 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years ago lived in Israel. That the rhythm of rain was so pronounced that we don't have even an appreciation of what it was about. But this is what Moshe is telling them in the Torah. He says, "Get ready, Jews." Right? It's interesting. How would Moshe know that? Right? How would Moshe know that? God had to notify him, because Moshe wouldn't have had first-hand knowledge about it. What Moshe knows only Egypt, Africa. He was never been to Israel, but he's telling the Jews, you should know that it's a blessing and a curse, right? The blessing is that you have this connection to God, that it's very responsive, but it's a curse too, that when we don't do it, it works against us. And as Fiddler in the Roof says, couldn't you choose somebody else for a change, right? The famous line. But this is the nature of what it means to be a Jew, and that is that we're so close to the lever, so to speak. And that's how the way it is in relationships is that, you can make a decision that I never want to feel loss. I don't want to get hurt. So people, you can close yourself off in life and say that if you never want to be disappointed, and if you never don't want to get angry, and if you never don't want to feel loss, then don't bother. Don't get involved with anything, right? But we all understand that to experience the full kaleidoscope of life means vulnerability is a double-edged sword. It allows you to experience things that you wouldn't other experience, but if you don't put yourself up, if you don't open yourself up to the possibility that you can't truly love something, if you also don't know that you can also lose it, and that is the relationship that we have living in the land of Israel. And Moshe also warns the Jewish people that there will come a point that the land will spit you out if you are not living the type of life. Moshe says that this land will spit you out, spit the Jewish people out if we don't live a holy life on this land, because it's God's land, it's a holy land. We have to live a certain way. And that's true. So imagine if you lived in a capital, using an example of a king, the king's ministers or people who are in the government have to live by a higher code of conduct than people who live out in the boondocks in Montana. I'm just using Montana as an example. I don't mean Montana specifically. But the idea is that the closer you are held to a different standard. And so when we say why it's not fair, why is Israel held to a different standard than the rest of the world? Because God does. God holds Israel. God holds the Jewish people to a different standard.
Well, God created everybody equal, but He created some people more equal.
Okay.
Is there some significance in terms of the water and all about Moses? You said, how does Moses know this? Is Moses considered like product of the water? Like, he was plucked from the Nile? Is he considered like
An Aquaman?
That's good.
Well, Moshe spent a lot of his career trying to find water in the desert and making water happen, right? It's not just he was saved from the water. Moshe's most challenging moments as a leader was providing water. His origin and his demise are around water, right?
Instead of,
Iraq,
Moshe dies and doesn't go into Israel because of water.
Because of water?
Yeah,
Well,
because he hits the rock.
He
Oh, the
was
rock.
The
yeah,
story is
right,
that the Jews needed water,
Right.
Right.
right? And God wanted him to provide water through a very spiritual way, and Moshe didn't do it the way God expected him to do it.
I heard that the 67 war was because of water. That
The Straits of Tiran, you're talking about now.
no, I'm talking about the 1967 war.
Uh-huh.
That I heard this when I was in Israel. That
The Jordan.
The Jordan was being blocked off from flowing by Syria, and that was
Historically, if you go back in history, most of wars were about water supply. That wasn't
Really?
nothing new.
But
Yeah.
on the other hand, also that's why Israel values water more than any other nation, and we are so high tech in it, and we help other countries. But California doesn't want our help.
Would we have? Yes. Yeah, so would we? Netafim. Is that the name of the company, Elfie?
What?
Netafim. I think it's called
Yeah.
drip water irrigation.
irrigation.
Yes.
It's a big deal.
Would we have discovered it if we have 3,500 years of trauma dealing with getting about water? Of course, we're driven to figure out how to keep the Kinneret alive. I mean, we live with this all the time.
We didn't exactly have neighbors that were willing to help us, right? You need some water, you can take some,
Yeah.
But
you have to
then
do
we,
it on our own or perish.
then we think also of community. We help other people, like in Africa and other countries. It's not that we're keeping it just for ourselves.
And this, true. And one more thing about this point before we.
It's called goodwill,
Mhm.
and trying to build relations with countries that, for no other reason, they might as well hate us because everybody else does. So you gotta win over these countries through the economic abilities that we can offer the countries.
Goodwill.
Yeah.
WELL.
Yeah, but also the economic, if we can offer a country something they can't do themselves, they're gonna have a bias towards us because we're helping them out.
All right, if we're not careful, we're gonna end up like last Tuesday. Okay.
Tuesday.
I'm saying there's a lot. Last Wednesday, there's a lot of material here that we're never gonna get
We're
to.
not having Torrenti anymore, right?
It'll come back.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. I don't have a choice. Tal's coming back tomorrow from Israel,
Okay.
and she has a whole list of things that she wants implemented very soon.
Okay.
The Torrenties are going to start again soon. One last thing on this point, and that is, to Elfie's point is that there are certain nations that were not allowed to join the Jewish people as a general rule. Anybody who wants to come and convert and become a Jew is allowed to come join the Jewish people. But the Torah marks off certain nations that were never allowed to convert, even third, fourth, fifth generation removed. Ironically, Egyptians, no problem. But the nations of Ammon and Moab, the Torah says, Lo yavo Ammoni u'Moavi b'kahal Hashem adolam. Forever. Why? The Torah goes on to say, you know why? Because when you were traveling and you needed water,
They-
Ashalo kidmu v'lechemu b'mayim, the Jewish people offered to buy water, and they said no. They said, out.
And wouldn't let them walk through.
They wouldn't let them
Right.
through. And so the Torah sees that such an egregious act to see people suffering from drought and not give them water. The Torah says this kind of character we don't want it in the Jewish people. We don't want it in our genes and our DNA. And you think about this. Where were these Jews coming from? From Egypt, who had imprisoned them, thrown their babies in the Nile, put them in servitude for hundreds of years. An Egyptian? Come on down. You want to be a Jew? No problem. Right? German? No problem. Ammon and Moab? Why? The Torah sees this as not as an aberration of one generation of cruelty, but something that's passed down. Why? Ammon and Moab are children of who? Who are they children of? They were Lot's children. Lot was Abraham's nephew. What was Abraham all about? He lived in the desert, and he welcomed people in and gave them food and drink. That idea that if you lived with the greatest benefactor, Abraham passed through his genes, through the DNA. The idea of Jewish DNA means that we are compassionate. We see people suffering. We need to help, right? The Talmud says that in Attractive Kedushin, the Talmud says that when one is searching for a potential in a relationship, you should look for. It says you should look for a couple of things. The Talmud always gives you advice what to look for in relationships.
They can give you water.
Make sure they have money. No, I'm kidding. It's not what. No.
Are there descendants of
Water bottle.
the Ammonites and the Moabites where the prohibition still applies?
I'll explain in a second. So the Talmud says that there are three things you should look for.
So what does the matchmaker need to know?
No, that,
Well,
It's
let's
all
do
right.
I want
three
him to
things.
continue, not to get distracted. I'm listening.
The Talmud says that you should look for three things: someone who is slightly bashful, someone who is merciful, who shows he has mercy, and someone who's kind. Those are the only three things you should be concerned with. The Talmud says. The Talmud goes on further. If you find someone who says they are Jewish, and they don't have these three character traits, look into their background. Ask them for proof. It's questionable whether they are really a Jew, because Abraham so influenced us, just through his power of the origins of what Judaism means, that we bashfulness means we have a sense of shame, that we have a sense of feeling of propriety, think right and wrong. Compassion, when you see someone suffering, not to turn away. And to be generous, to be benefactors, to help someone. Gomlei chasadim, Hebrew free loan. That's what so many laws about not charging interest and looking out for the widow and the orphan. How the Torah? Why? The Torah tells us that we have to live up to a certain ideal, right? Now you think about it, because tzedakah, right? Every culture has welfare systems. Judaism does not see tzedakah as charity, as doing something good for somebody else. Think about it. When someone asks you, what does tzedakah mean in a word? How would you translate tzedakah in a word? So most people say, I don't know, charity. Right? It's a classic translation. But you know what charity means in English? Or a charitable organization? That we're doing something kind for somebody else. Right? We're benevolent. Every culture has benevolent societies or charitable societies, welfare societies that we look out for the less fortunate. Judaism doesn't see it that way. Why does the Torah have a system where we can't charge interest to another Jew? Why does the Torah call this with the word tzedakah?
Isn't it mitzvah driven? Charity?
But why is it mitzvah driven? How can you command someone to do something?
But
It's
the idea
holy.
is that it's making you closer to God. It's a
But that's great. But that's an ideal that one can aspire to. But a commandment means that it's binding. So how does the Torah force you to behave in a way that that goes beyond basic law? The answer is.
Because you wanna be a tzaddik.
But what is tzaddik? What's the root of tzaddik or tzedakah?
Between the community, between from man
Justice.
to man kindness, not between God and you.
The word tzedakah comes from the word tzedek.
Yeah.
Tzedek means justice, right?
Between community, not.
But what's the difference between justice and charity? It's a different meaning. Charity means I don't have to do it. Nobody forces you to be charitable. We'll give you a plaque. We'll thank you. We'll make you a dinner. We'll clap our hands. But if I'm forced to do something, it's a tax. It's not charity. Tzedek, justice, means that you have to. Justice means that if the Torah requires us to establish justice in our, right? So, by the way, tzedakah is not an option. Giving a loan without interest is not an option. We have to do it. That's why every community has Hebrew free loans. Why would we do it? It's an option. It's a nice thing to do. But the Hebrew free loan is older than most Jewish organizations in this city and most cities. You know why? Because the Torah doesn't give you an option. The Torah says, you may say, oh, then I won't. If I can't charge interest, I won't lend. I won't be an idiot. I can put my money in better places. The Torah says no. You have to, because if you don't do it, you're not doing just with the resources that God gave you. Judaism sees that everything we have in life is that we are entrusted. We are God's trustees. God gives us something and He expects us to dispense it according to the way the Torah tells us. When we don't, we are, what's the term, if you're a trustee of an organization, you're acting against your fiduciary responsibility, right? When we are not, quote unquote, charitable, we are lacking fiduciary responsibility, God takes it away from us. So therefore, we don't see tzedakah as benevolence, as something to do. I've told I told the story before, probably, I don't know how many years ago, I don't know, it's hard for me to remember all the stories that I've told you, if you don't remember the stories I've told you. But I'm assuming at some point I've probably told you the story. Right? I always say this because the stories in the Talmud, so I assume I've told you almost most of the stories in the Talmud at some point. There are so many stories in the Talmud, so maybe I didn't tell you. But
They are obviously
anyway,
worth repeating.
the Talmud records
That way we can get
The Talmud
started
records
continuously.
that one of the most wealthy families in Jerusalem during the time of the destruction of the temple. It's related to what I want to talk about tonight. There were three uber wealthy families that were supporting Jerusalem during a siege, almost a 3-year siege of Jerusalem, and kept the entire population alive. Long story short, years later, after Jerusalem finally fell, if I go into the whole reason why the siege eventually, for 3 years the Jews were able to hold out because of these three individuals. Eventually,
Also water, wasn't that?
they had water, but I mentioned that the other day, right? Yes, they had the Gichon spring, the Shiloh, exactly. These three families eventually were compromised, and people blew up these storehouses because they wanted to force the Jewish people into famine in order that they should fight back against the Romans. Long story short, but for a long time they held out the entire population of Jerusalem, and they just opened it up and they gave everybody for free whatever they wanted. About 75 years after the destruction of the temple, the leader of the Jewish community, his name was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He was a great grandson of the rabbis who were martyred by the Romans 75 years earlier. Rabbi Yehuda, who was the leader of the Jewish people, relates that he was one time, it was a very, very difficult time, he sees a woman comes over to him and he says, Rabbi Parnaseni, support me, help me, Rabbi. And he said, he looks at, he says, he recognized her, and he went, who are you? He told him who she was. He says, you're a grandchild of that family, the most wealthiest family in Jerusalem. What happened?